Scott, I want to get to your extraordinary new book in a moment, but first I want to draw on your experience as a professor of business at NYU and talk about the economy. Americans really turned on President Biden because he tried to tell them everything was okay and they knew it wasn't. And now, not even a year into his presidency, Trump is facing the same dilemma. You cannot tell Americans things are cheaper and there's no inflation because the one thing they know for sure is how much everything costs. Inflation is down, so why are things so tough right now?
Yeah, so inflation, it's down, but it's still kind of sticky. And if you look at the producers' price index, it's come down, but the CPI is, or the confidence index, people are actually less confident that they've been in a while. And I think a lot of it is that, the bottom line is, Elizabeth, I think it all comes back to the same boring place, and that is for the first time in history, a 30-year-old isn't doing as well as his or her parents were at 30. So there's a lot of shame and rage amongst young people, and housing continues to get more expensive, education continues to get more expensive, and their purchasing power has kind of barely kept up with inflation. And when young people aren't doing well, there's a ripple-on effect because their parents are angry. And that is, if your kids can't afford to have a home, if your son isn't economically viable and is having trouble finding a romantic partnership, and every day you feel as if you're not keeping up, and 210 times a day you're reminded on your phone that if you're not in Saint-Tropez or in or have a Gulfstream that you're somehow failing. I just think the emotional anxiety is playing a big role, because if you look at things, and again, it doesn't help to say this, things may not be ideal, but they have been a lot worse before. And I say that as not a fan of the president's, but the economy, in my view, has been remarkably resilient in the face of some headwinds.
Trump just proposed, like literally in the last hour, no tax on overtime, no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security. Will those things make a difference, enough of a difference for enough people?
I think it's mostly populist. The no tax on tips thing, it actually impacts very few people. And what I don't get is he's proposing to pay for it with money they're collecting from the tariffs. So let me tax consumers and then give it back to certain. It just seems like a very inefficient way. One of the things I admire about Republican ideology is that if you just let people keep as much money as possible, they'll figure out the most productive ways to use that capital. And this, to me, seems very like we're going to increase taxes in the form of tariffs and then redistribute it. I don't know. It feels a little populist. I think that no tax on tips and overtime, if it puts more money in the pockets of the middle class, great. But I'm just somewhat skeptical. The no tax on tips thing, when you really looked at who it impacts, most of these people don't itemize their tax deduction to begin with.
Right.
And there was a limit on it. So it felt more populist than actually impactful.
It's also a small percentage of the population, but you brought up tariffs. Trump is now reversing himself on many of his tariffs, lifting them on many products. He seems to be acknowledging that other countries did not, in fact, pay these tariffs. American consumers did.
I taught micro and macroeconomics in graduate school, and we used to talk about tariffs in the light of, can you believe how stupid these people were to believe this would actually work? We thought this was a thing of the past, this level of tariffs. And if you were looking for the most elegant way to reduce prosperity, it'd be pretty difficult to find something better than tariffs. And in addition, it's not even the tariffs themselves that I think are really going to hurt America over the long term. It's a lack of dependability and reliability on the U.S. as a trading partner, because the tariffs seem to be a function of his blood sugar level that day. And so the objective of the tariffs was to inspire a lot of deal making with the U.S. and bring back manufacturing. It's had the entirely the opposite impact, and that is there's a lot of deal making right now. Unfortunately, it's deal making to get around the U.S. It's the Prime Minister of Canada going to Asia. Japan, South Korea, and China are speaking for the first time in a long time. Everyone's trying to reroute their supply chain and diversify away from what is seen as an undependable American administration. And when you look at a place like Canada, the largest undefended border in the world, tremendous friends of ours, 70% of their exports into the U.S., quite frankly, they screwed up. They trusted us. We are really taking a hammer to their economy. And then on the reverse side, we asymmetrically benefit from trade with Canada because we sell high margin products in that trade at a higher multiple in our market. So for every dollar of trade exports into Canada, we're probably getting $3 in shareholder value, whereas they're just getting 1 for 1. So we benefit asymmetrically from these trading relationships, and yet we've decided The definition of stupid, according to Professor Carlo Cipolla from Berkeley, is something that hurts other people while hurting yourself. By that measure, these tariffs could not be more stupid.
What about the 50-year mortgage that President Trump has proposed? There's a housing crisis in this country, but isn't the problem there's not enough housing? What will a 50-year mortgage do to solve that?
Look, the idea is it does reduce the monthly payment a little bit. But basically, one of the wonderful things about housing is that in terms of other asset classes, it hasn't outperformed other asset classes, but it's a forced savings mechanism. People, when you ask them to contribute money to their 401k every month, may or may not, but people don't want to be kicked out of their house. So it's traditionally been a great way to build wealth because it's sort of a forced savings mechanism. You build equity. You know, I would argue that a 15-year mortgage is probably even better than a 30-year because for a little bit more money in 15 years, you own your home outright. The idea of making that payment for 50 years and paying kind of double the interest, to me, that feels, some people would argue it's innovation. I would argue that you're indenturing yourself. So people have to make their own decisions, but I would never recommend anyone take out a 50-year mortgage.
Yeah, double the interest is the key part of that because a lot of people, wait a second, double the interest. That is a significant sum of money. All right, let's talk about the crisis confronting young men in this country. You write about this in your new book, Notes on Being a Man. You say that young American men are more likely to suffer addiction, more likely to slip into depression, land in jail, remain single, remain isolated, even kill themselves than any previous generation of men. What is happening?
Yeah, it would be hard to identify a cohort that has fallen further faster than young men over the last 20 years. If you walk into a morgue and there's 5 people who died by suicide, Elizabeth, 4 are men. So 4 times more likely to kill themselves. We have a homeless and an opiate crisis, but what we really have is a male homeless and a male opiate crisis. They're 3 times more likely to be addicted, 12 times more likely to be incarcerated. Only 1 in 3 men under the age of 30 is in a relationship, whereas 2 in 3 women are in a relationship. And you think, well, that's mathematically impossible. It's not, because women are dating older because they want more economically and emotionally viable men. You have now 1 in 7 men are qualify as NEETs. They're neither in education, employment, or training. They're essentially doing nothing. 1 out of 3 men under the age of 25 still lives at home. 1 out of 5 men at 30 is still living at home. So we have essentially a group of people who are becoming just very unproductive citizens. And the result is the deaths of despair, drunk driving accidents, suicide, opiate addiction, overdoses. Since 2002, for the last 23 years, more men have died incrementally, not men who are dying from deaths of despair, but additional deaths from despair is greater than the number of young men who were lost in World War II. So this is taking a real toll on households and on young men. And we were off mic talking about the struggles of young men. When a boy loses a male role model, at that moment, he's more likely to be incarcerated than graduate from college. And the interesting thing about that data, Elizabeth, is that a girl in a single parent home has similar outcomes, same rates of college attendance, same rates of self-harm. What it ends up is that while boys are physically stronger, they're emotionally and neurologically much weaker than girls. And what we're seeing is the kind of economic sucking sound of economic prosperity being transferred from young to old, which has happened over the last 40 years, is having a disproportionately negative effect on young men.
So you're saying that young women are better equipped somehow to deal with all the headwinds that are derailing young men?
That's what the data shows. When a woman doesn't have a romantic relationship, oftentimes she pours that energy back into her friend network and her professional life. If a man hasn't cohabitated or been married by the time he's 30, there's a 1 in 3 chance he's going to be a substance abuser. There's this cartoon, Elizabeth, of a woman in her 30s who didn't find romantic love, sitting in the windowsill with cats, staring out depressed. Like, what a tragedy that Lisa didn't find love. Guess what, Elizabeth? Lisa's just fine. The data's clear. Widows are happier after their husband dies. Widowers are less happy after their wife dies. Women in relationships do live longer, 2 to 4 years. Men in relationships live 4 to 7 years longer. So just the outcomes, the rates of self-harm, it ends up, the bottom line is men need relationships more than women. And essentially women are more resilient. They don't know if it's because women have had to endure menstruation or childbirth, but it ends up, I'll give you a really frightening statistic. 2 15-year-olds, a boy and a girl, both sexually molested. Neither crime is less heinous than the other, the boy is 10 times more likely to kill himself later in life. So what we're coming to grips with the fact is that men and boys are neurologically weaker and need relationships more. Now, I want to be clear, that doesn't mean they're entitled to relationships. No group is expected or responsible for servicing another group of men. But the reality is men need relationships more than women.
You know, how big a role does social media play in all of this? The governor of Utah, after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, called social media a cancer on society. This young man who killed Charlie spent endless hours in his home or in his basement playing video games, then got a rifle. You warn that too many young men are simply isolating themselves. You even actually said about AI that the greatest threat of AI, hands down, in my view, is loneliness, because AI, like social media, keeps you isolated. And somehow you're in a relationship with technology and something that isn't even real.
Yeah, I think the biggest threat of AI is not self-healing weapons or that become sentient, but we're essentially, unfortunately, 40% of the S&P by market value is 10 companies whose primary job is to convince you to spend more and more time. Every minute they can get you from your regular life to on this is tens of billions of dollars in incremental shareholder value. And the way they do that is by tapping into an immature brain, especially young people, especially young men who crave dopa. And the net effect is the following. We have attached our economy's prosperity to an objective of evolving a new species of asocial and asexual males. The amount of time 20 to 30-year-old males spend outside is now less than prison inmates. And you were talking about Charlie Kirk. As we're arguing over the fonts on a shell casing to try and blame one side or the other, the reality is it's a hollow argument. Most of these men are not actually that politically engaged. What they are is all young men, from the person who killed Kennedy to Abraham Lincoln. They're young men who lack purpose, aren't attaching to relationships. And then most recently, all of these political shooters are extremely online. And then the kind of kickers, they have access to guns. But this argument over political ideology is a hollow argument. There's just too many men not attaching to relationships. And we're mammals. We go crazy without relationships. Put an orc in a tank alone, see what happens. Worst thing you can do to a human is solitary confinement. People would much rather be in dangerous situations than be put in solitary confinement in prisons. And then leave your dog alone and see what happens without another dog. And I worry that we're essentially using, they have this indomitable foe of big tech, trying to convince them they can have a reasonable facsimile of life online, and they wake up without skills, without relationships, anxious, obese, and we're just in the most unstable, violent societies in the world, Elizabeth, have one thing in common, and that's a disproportionate amount of young men with a lack of economic or romantic possibilities. They have been the most dangerous group of people in history, constantly weaponized, and constantly, quite frankly, prone to nationalist content.
Right. Well, obviously, many political leaders are taking note of this. Governor Gavin Newsom of California recently issued an executive order calling on the state to, quote, confront California's growing crisis of connection and opportunity for men and boys. Former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who also is thinking about running for president, wrote an op-ed about young men saying, quote, you don't have to be an incel to believe that the system is fundamentally broken and rigged against your success. Incels obviously being disaffected, often angry young men. Incel is short for involuntarily celibate.
Yeah, and also Governor Moore of Maryland has announced that the focus of administration and his top priority was to focus on the struggles of young men and boys. Elizabeth, if he'd said that 5 years ago, I can't imagine the blowback he would have received. When I started talking about this 5 years ago, the dialogue was so much less productive, and the data is so overwhelming. I mean, to the far right's credit, they recognized the problem first. The problem was their solution was to take women and non-whites back to the 50s, and that they conflate or inversely correlate the ascent with women as the cause for men's descent.
Of their misery and their failure, yeah.
That's just not true. That's like blaming immigrants for your economic problems. That's when I know when I talk to a young man, they've come off the tracks. If it wasn't for women in factories, we wouldn't have won World War II. If it wasn't women entering the workforce in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, our economy, we'd be a second-tier economy. And we should be celebrating our our mothers and our sisters' economic progress. It's been huge to the economic growth and well-being of America. But there's just the notion that all of a sudden our government programs actually focusing on these individuals is really remarkable, because the gag reflex that you got 5 years ago when we talked about this was understandable. Because if you look at from 1945 to 2000, America registered a third of the economic growth globally, which was 5% of the population. We had 6 times the prosperity. And then with that incredible prosperity, we crammed it into the 1/3 of the population that was white, male, and heterosexual. I got unfair advantage. There's no denying I got unfair advantage. The issue is we're now holding a 19-year-old accountable for my unfair advantage. And I think the answer then is that men of my generation have a debt. One, to promote policies that lift up young people economically. The economic damage done to the younger generations has had a disproportionately negative effect on men. I think if we put more money in young people's pockets, it'll have a disproportionately positive impact on men. And also, men my age need to step up. There are 3 times as many women applying to be big sisters of New York as there are men applying to be big brothers. If we want better men, we need to be better men, but we have a debt. And what I would say to everyone out there is, I understand your gag reflex when I talk about this. I've had a 3,000-year head start, but should we be holding a 19-year-old male accountable for should he be paying the penalty for my unfair advantage?
Charlie Kirk and a whole constellation of bro podcasters are out there trying to reach these young men, people like Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, Tim Dillon. And young men have turned out to be a potent political force at times. The young men helped propel Trump back into office. 56% of men under 30 voted for Trump. Is it because they thought Trump would make things better for them? Because then we see the New York City mayoral election and young men turned out in force for a Democratic socialist named Zoran Mamdani.
So I believe that the problem of young men, and granted, I'm a hammer, so everything I see is a nail, but I think struggling young men is the reason that we elected Trump. And if you look at the groups that pivoted hardest from blue to red, 2020 to 2024, first was Latinos. I don't think we can take a lot from that, because it's even weird we categorize it as one community, because there's so much disparity within that community. The second group was young people. And when you're under the age of 30 and you're not doing well, you just want change. But the most interesting group is the third hardest pivot was from women aged 45 to 64. And my thesis, Elizabeth, is that's their mothers. Because in the United States,
there's still young men.
In the United States, there's a disproportionate amount of women who will still vote for who they perceive is in the best interest of their husbands and their sons. And if your son is in the basement playing video games and vaping, you don't care about territorial sovereignty in Ukraine or transgender rights. So Mamdani was elected for the same reason Trump was. And that is, if you're not doing well, you just want change. And Biden and Cuomo both represented the status quo. So they're willing to vote for a chaos candidate, insurrection or not, I don't care. But also Trump, to his credit, flew right into the manosphere. And by going on Rogan, 55 million views. Harris, to match that exposure, would have had to have gone on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox every night for 3 hours for 2 weeks. If she had taken the bus to Austin, it would have been worth her time.
Yeah. We're seeing, finally, a lot of cracks right now in both parties. There's a divide in the Democratic Party between the progressives like Mamdani and moderates like the newly elected governors of Virginia and New Jersey. But we're also seeing some cracks in Trump's big MAGA coalition, this epic fallout that's happening right now between President Trump and Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is ordinarily one of his most ardent and enthusiastic supporters. What do you think is happening? Is there some conclusion, or is it just this is what happens? You know, people who are together for 1 year and one election end up falling apart.
I do think that Marjorie Taylor Greene is a bit of a canary in the coal mine, or a canard of what is. I was shocked to see her come out as aggressively. And I think she's done some polling.
On two things, the economy and Epstein. She's the one who was saying at the very beginning, these health care insurance premiums are dangerous, and this is going to hurt a lot of Republicans in the country. We need to do something.
Yeah, and I didn't think the Democrats should have caved on the shutdown, but they have a solid argument, and that is they picked an issue that actually will impact Republicans more. And they've really highlighted the fact that, about 14 million Americans are about to lose their health insurance, and millions are going to see their rates skyrocket. I think If you look at a survey of the happiest nations in the world, 6 of 10 are in Northern Europe. And happiness, we tend to believe in America, it's about what you can get. Happiness also, though, is about a fear from anxiety about things being taken away from you. And essentially in Denmark, if your wife is diagnosed with lung cancer, it doesn't mean you're going bankrupt. Whereas in the US, there's a 1 in 3 chance that that'll happen when your wife is diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. 40% of American households have medical debt. Just the amount of anxiety people are feeling and the shame. You know, you imagine you got a 17-year-old daughter and you have to borrow money for her to fix her root canal. I mean, this is just the anxiety I think Americans are feeling economically is pretty severe, and the Democrats focused on that. And also the Epstein files, there's just no getting around it. The president, he looks, I jokingly say my 5-year-old once drew on the wall, and the moment he realized he spelled out his own name, he knew he just looked very guilty. I feel like Trump could not be acting more guilty because people have forgiven him for a lot. And so he's acting like there's something really, really ugly in here. And I think for the first time, Republicans are seeing political advantage in taking him on, whereas before it was radioactive to get anywhere near the third rail of challenging the president. It feels like his grip on power is beginning to slip.
We'll see. I don't know. She also sounds like she wants to make up. So, and it's an interesting moment, though. I agree with you. And it will be very telling what happens in the coming weeks. Scott Galloway, always a pleasure to talk to you. Congratulations on the book, Notes on Being a Man. It's a signed reading to both my sons, who are young men. Really, really great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Congrats on all your success.
Thank you, Scott.